I'm excited to introduce presenter Michelle Franco. Michelle Arevalos Franco's research commits to interdisciplinary design practice to the intersecting projects of social and ecological justice and is grounded in her Mexican roots. Her recent publications focus on Latin immigrant labor and the construction and maintenance of landscapes. Franco is an assistant professor in the landscape architecture at The Ohio State University. She was a landscape designer at Ohm van Sweden and Associates in Washington, D.C., and holds a master's degree in landscape architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Prior, Franco was the program director at the Richard Avedon Foundation in New York and received a Bachelor's of Fine Arts from the University of Arizona. Please welcome Michelle Arevalos Franco.
So nice to be here with you today. I'm going to share with you a methodology that I call the scale of labor that I've been developing as part of my teaching and research practice. So I'll start with some context to kind of just ground my goals here, and then I'll share with you some examples of the scale of labor at work. So landscaper is a divisive term. It rankles those with professional credentials in landscape architecture to be confused with landscapers. No, in fact, we say, I'm not a landscaper. We typically then describe the bigger, more complex endeavors of ecology, master planning, public park and urban plaza design, restoration, and so on. And it's true, landscape architects, many of them at least sometimes do those things. But all the same, landscape architects design landscapes that require care and maintenance. And we often subordinate that as the so-called unskilled labor of landscaping. So this area of discomfort, which necessitates assertion of one's professional distinction apart from the manual work confused with it, is meaningful. It's an act protective of social status. It demarcates boundaries. It also disciplines and divides, and it can devalue. Because of this piece of the long history of labor's devaluation, I call myself a landscaper, even though I have a master's in landscape architecture from Harvard and I teach design at a well-known institution. But it's a semantic choice, and the activities I do that justify it, they're very deliberate. So I don't wish to appropriate the work of care that landscapers do, claiming it as the newfound jurisdiction of the professional class. But my reclamation of this disliked word, I hope, starts to include manual landscape laborers in our discourse as landscape professionals. I want to consciously position landscapers' work as critical and equal in value to our work as designers. Laborers and designers are both situated actors in the historical divisions of labor that govern landscape practice and pedagogy, and these divisions are longstanding. So contemporary landscape architecture is generally understood as a direct evolution from 18th century European landscape gardening, wherein aristocrats owned the land, middle-class intellectuals designed the landscape, and working-class laborers made it material. Sounds pretty familiar, right? The upper classes at this time made great efforts to hide the bodies and the activities of laborers in the garden. Workers were omnipresent, but behind the scenes, doing the back-breaking work of land clearance, tree felling, pruning, chopping, digging, hoeing, weeding, fencing and hurdle making, hedging, road mending, haulage, and so on. What historian James Turner refers to this as the violent labor of the landscape was carefully removed from the final picture of the English landscape garden, that version destined for the clawed glass. And no radical changes really in this division of labor and its invisibility have been made since this time. Production continues to be willfully separated from consumption. Consider the many renderings and photographs of contemporary landscape architecture. Are they not also an image in the glass? And in the United States today, landscape work also tends to fracture along race in addition to class divisions. And these divisions between mental and menial, conception and execution, controllers and workers claim inevitability simply because they are the foundational social relations of capital. And these divisions also exist between brown skin and white. The physical labor of design is done most often by those in precarious social and economic positions, recipients of increasingly politicized race and class antagonisms. In states with high rates of immigration, like California, Texas, Arizona, and Florida, the workforce in construction and landscaping is 70 to 80% immigrants. And they're primarily from Mexico and Central America. Though often obscured, especially in states with lower rates of immigration, the racial lines drawn throughout landscape work are not ambiguous. In the modern colonial era, hard physical labor was deemed fit only for brown people. And credentialism gives these racial divisions bureaucratic power. We know that professions are defined by who is not included, and that these exclusions are necessary to the formation and to the continued existence of a profession. Architecture and landscape architecture's similar evolutions privileged middle and upper class white men who could navigate the economic and social barriers to credentialing. And so, of course, while it may justly be argued that professionalization is a necessary legal control for the public's health and welfare, it's important now to acknowledge the social stratification and the hierarchies of power that credentialing naturalizes. Are they still viable, valid, justifiable? Because of the rigid legal, economic, and social boundaries of professionalization, the designer and the landscaper operate at a great social and spatial distance from one another. At times, these worlds touch briefly in practice, but typically the exchange between designer and laborer functions within ingrained norms of social hierarchy, with transmission of knowledge operating in a one-way direction from professional expert to so-called unskilled laborer. The academy, the domain which trains future professional landscape architects through pedagogy and research, often buttresses these existing hierarchies. So one example, labor is not included as part of the knowledge base necessary to train future landscape architects. There's education, of course, on the labor processes of nature itself, which we sometimes call ecology or restoration or non-human agency or even just process. But knowledge about the social and economic conditions of human landscape laborers is not required, nor is knowledge about the current demographics or working conditions of this population. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a slide here. But as confirmed by CLARB and LAB, who manage licensure of landscape architects and their training requirements, landscape laborers do not appear in their standards of assessment. So beyond practical repercussions for practice, this institutionalized erasure implicitly devalues the labor and lives of workers who construct and maintain landscapes, removing them from consideration in the process and practice of design. So, but I believe that this can be changed, and I'll plug here an open letter I've been organizing to the licensure and accreditation boards on the topic of immigrant landscape labor, and I would very much welcome your signature. You can read the letter in both Spanish and English and sign it via this QR code. And here I'm aiming to expand inclusion for laborers within those bureaucratic structures of the profession. And then this is part of my continued question, what are other possible futures for landscape pedagogy and research that include laborers? As a Mexican-American, a native Californian, and a professional trained in landscape architecture, the race and class frictions embedded in landscape work are ever present, patently visible to me. And it's difficult for me to ignore that in the landscape office, people are generally white, caring for the landscapes on site. They are more often than not brown. And I occupy both spaces in different ways. I can speak the language of immigrant landscape laborers linguistically and through the language of the garden itself, which I know and love, the weeding, pruning, raking, the maintenance. But I can also fit through education and cultural rapport into the world of landscape professionals, clients, and academics. So this intertwined positionality is a privileged view into this two divided, distanced landscapes. And I'm convinced by Donna Haraway's assertion that nothing comes without its world. So for me, landscape architecture does not come without its world. And in this case, I mean the lives and work of landscape laborers foundational to the very existence of my profession, landscape architecture. I'm also influenced by Max Liberon's definition of scale, and this enlarges the notion of scale understood primarily as an architectural or spatial concept. In this definition, scale is about what relationships matter within a particular context. So I'd like my work as a designer, an academic, a landscaper, a person to operate at a relational scale. And I'll make the argument that this scale is the scale of labor. And shifting scales in this way reframes those divisions of labor that form the basis of our work as designers, professionals, students, and researchers. So I'll start off with an ongoing research project. Started in February of 22. I worked for 4 days with a crew of jardineros, gardeners, doing landscape maintenance. Like me, jardineria was born in Los Angeles, and in its current form, the industry is dominated by Mexican and Central American immigrants, like my own family. So this is research that resonates with me personally, professionally, politically. And the division of labor that exists in landscape production feels almost like a division of self, a borderlands, as Gloria Anzaldúa describes, which is familiar to many children of immigrants. So it was with this intention to know more fully the parts of my own entanglements with landscape labor, those that have been excised through professional training, that I temporarily joined this crew on a very chilly week in LA in February. So this crew is small. It's divided into 3 teams of 2 men each. And Rogelio and Emiliano do the mow and blow work. Saul and Diego do construction. You can see them here. And Ignacio and Eloy's work is closest to gardening. And all but 2 of the men, including Eusebio, who runs the operation, are from Oaxaca. So I spend a day working with each team, and I mean physically working, raking, weeding, carrying soil, trimming, tidying up. And I've written about this in a paper called Migration and Maintenance, Mesoamerican Making of Landscapes in El Norte. And that's going to be published by Dumbarton Oaks, hopefully later this year or early next year. And in that paper, I describe the physical work in a lot of detail. One aim of this research is academics, to consider the long trajectory of colonialism in Latin America and how those living forces structure landscape work today. But another aim is to put into practice this alternative methodology of researching. So I'll just focus on what that practice allows for here. First, it is particular. It places emphasis on the micro-narrative rather than the macro-narratives that structure colonial rationalities. And so these micro-narratives are pluriversal, they're multiple, they're overlapping, and they're certainly not fixed. And second, the work is embodied. So unlike research conducted at an academic remove, this research is somatic and personal. It's a process informed by physical capacities and experienced subjectivities. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, it allows for time spent together. It's unstructured and collective this time. Informal conversations, quiet activity, and shared goals emerge under the construct of shared physical labor. And the physical context of the work is important because in this setting, the laborers are the experts. So I hope that this mode of physically working together operates as a kind of speaking with rather than speaking for. And by centering this research on what is collective knowing and doing, kind of untidy, particular relational narratives emerge. And more importantly, actual relationships emerge. In this research, the relations were bridges across this divided landscape of designer and laborer. And this scale of labor is also pedagogy for training future designers and researchers. In my Diggers studio, which I've done for 2 summers in a row, it's a design studio, I bring landscape architecture students in direct contact with landscape laborers through this shared physical work. So here, design students learn from those who construct and maintain landscapes. In the summers of 22 and 23, we worked with a groundskeeping crew for the city of Columbus on a park designed by a prominent Midwest landscape firm. And it surprised many of the students that there was nuance to the work, that it had to be learned and practiced. A revelatory for the students was our crew leader's assessment of the site design itself, understood by his own experience maintaining it. So he pointed out design details that made his work of leaf blowing or moving his truck or cart through the site frustrating or impossible. And the students were thrilled by the idea that they could apply this knowledge of real world maintenance proactively in a design. So working at the scale of labor, you begin to understand that maintainers, especially in the public realm, are the people who spend the most time in a designed landscape, getting to know it intimately through duration and care. And this opens a whole realm of radical reframing for design to consider the laborer as public, as a client. So after our service learning modules with landscape maintenance crews, ecological restoration workers, urban agriculture, and nursery operations, the students and I work collectively to design and build a community green space in Columbus. So in 22, we worked to connect trails in a wooded riverside park by the city's reservoir. We removed massive quantities of honeysuckle. We surveyed and graded the site. We planted native woodland species, and we used fallen trunks in the park to create a seat wall overlooking the newly accessible view of the reservoir. And the students took great pride in their efforts and their very, very hard work. It was a very hot summer, so it was intense. And then in 2023, we worked to create a community nursery, which also functions as just a public garden and a food forest along the edge in a primarily immigrant neighborhood. So in the 4 weeks that we labored on this site, we removed invasive honeysuckle, we pruned and removed trees, we laid down a mulch path, constructed mobile furniture, we planted native prairie beds, and the most laborious of all was we constructed our own soil mixture from elements of the city's waste stream. One other important aspect of the work this past summer was developing notational systems for labor activities, and this is inspired by dance notation. So the work here is in understanding, documenting, and inventing the sequences of movement for landscape labor. And this allowed us to consider ideas such as the necessity of inefficiency, pleasure as experienced by the worker, sequencing of rest, and the unique capabilities of individual bodies, bodily responses of resistance and friction, and so on. Kind of ideas that we don't usually think about when we're designing a landscape. And it's a work in progress, but I think also that this kind of close observation and documentation of labor is required in order to conscientiously incorporate the needs and priorities of laborers into the design process and the design itself. And one important lesson that I want the students to take away, both from working alongside laborers and conducting collective labor themselves, is to understand the full capacity of physical labor. Yes, it can be exploitative, and often it is in contemporary landscape work, but it can also be a sense of belonging. It can be care, it can be love, it can be community. And so it has all of these remarkable transformative capacities that remain mostly untapped within the profession's relationship with labor currently. And I'm not interested in this project kind of as a technocratic exercise to increase the efficiency and productivity of the private practice model. Instead, I view working at the scale of labor as an empathetic inhabitation of social difference. And we're all workers and we can be allies. And one way to fuse these bonds is to literally do the same work side by side. Because the division of labor in practice is so entrenched and slower to shift, the classroom may be the only opportunity designers have to work side by side with those who build and maintain landscapes. So at minimum, this radical pedagogy that asks, who are we learning from, might denaturalize expectations of what and how landscape professionals do, might embed necessary critiques of professionalization itself, and could create different desires for practice and new trajectories for research. Okay, so to wrap it up, what is the scale of labor? It is laboring together, working with as a radical act of understanding and care. It is an appeal to form relations. It's an invitation to examine and respond to the hierarchies and divisions that structure our own work as professionals. The scale of labor is simple. It means that which can be held within arm's length. So a rake, a pot of soil, a driver chatting next to you, a truck bed full of mulch, a new friend weeding by your side in the grass. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions and discussion. Thanks for listening.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. That was a wonderful and such a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing your expertise. We do have some time for question and answers. Everyone on the call, please feel free to post your questions directly. I'm just going to navigate over to the questions page. Okay. Michelle, how much have your designs been influenced by what you've learned from those installing them? They are, as you said, the experts in the works in reality.
Well, I'm an academic, so I don't do a lot of design work now, but I do work with students often on thinking about how, with these students in particular that have gotten this embodied experience, to kind of reframe what they're designing and to think about how is this going to be used? How is this going to be maintained over time? And what kind of adjustments can you make when you consider ultimately like that the client is not just, let's say, the person who lives at the house, but also the person who maintains that space. And I have also kind of applied this approach in the classroom with students who have not done this kind of embodied work. And they're still very interested in kind of like this reframing. So I think in my experience, students who are going to be future, designing the landscapes of the future are ready to kind of tackle this head on. So that's really exciting.
Okay, thank you. I'm surprised that LA students would not have had any experience in any landscapes as a career of the land, or as carers of the land. Students in LA? Is that what the
comment?
Yeah, the question Let me just reread the question.
Okay.
I'm surprised that LA students would not have had any experience in any landscapes as carers of the land.
LA as in landscape architecture, not Los Angeles. That's what I was confused.
Yes.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I mean, my own grad school experience in landscape architecture, and then when I first started teaching, I kind of just realized that most of our students and most of my colleagues when I was in grad school had no experience working in a landscape, like, and I just was so shocked by that because I did. And it made sense then, like your trajectory makes a little more sense. But I kind of made it my mission. I don't think any landscape architect, we should not grant degrees in landscape architecture without, for a student who has like never touched a plant or planted a plant or dug a hole or just been working outside. Like, to me, that makes absolutely no sense. So that is kind of why I structured this summer studio, to give students that experience before they graduate. And I think it's really important. Right now, the studio is like an option studio, so it's not required for all the students. And I personally think that something like that should be part of the core curriculum. And that's kind of why I'm trying to structure this open letter to the accreditation boards, because that's how core curriculum gets put in place, is what's required for accreditation. So if we can start to move the needle a little bit in terms of accreditation in the landscape architecture program requires kind of an embodied experience in the landscape or a knowledge of landscape labor in some way, things will change more rapidly.
Perfect. Thank you. And you answered the follow-up to that.
Great.
Let's see. Let me pull up the chat. Do you have any recommendations for advice for landscape workers trying to advocate for themselves, for pay raises, continued learning opportunities, for bilingual trainings with their supervisors and bosses?
I think a lot of that is very contextual, and it depends on the precarity of the individual worker and what their vulnerabilities are, right? So I think there's a whole range of, like, there are many undocumented workers where it would be probably pretty impossible to advocate for oneself in a safe way. There is one app that I know about. It's an immigrant rights organization out of New York, and the app is called Reclamo, and it helps, I think, primarily undocumented laborers, but probably all laborers, file claims for wage theft, which happens a lot, especially for construction and landscaping workers. So this is one of the biggest, like, precarities in this kind of work is wage theft. Well, basically, you just like don't get paid for the hours you work, or you work extra, don't get the benefits that you've been promised, things like that. So the app basically does the processing of the application with the Department of Labor for you. So it kind of helps people jump the hurdle of like fear, but also language is often a barrier. So it translates into Spanish and other indigenous languages. So it's a like really cool, great resource. And that, I think it just launched last year. So it's called Reclamo, Reclamo. So that's something very specific, but maybe would be useful. And then I don't know, I believe I'm a little bit more of an advocate for people who have more privilege and power to advocate on behalf of workers, just because that seems like a safer approach than asking people who are already experiencing precarity and vulnerability to take more risks. So I think that if you are involved in a design firm or you're in a landscape contracting, if you have a position of power in any of these kind of workplaces, I think it's kind of your responsibility to advocate for those who have less power than you do.
Thank you. Could you comment more on your use of Laban notation, particularly how it informs your students' designs?
Yeah, so this was a new kind of workshop that we did. So at OSU, we have the largest archive of dance notation in the country, which was a surprise to me. But so we had this workshop with a choreographer, and she's the curator of the dance notation collection at OSU. And so we started out with like just trying to understand how the symbols are organized and what each one means. And this is very extensive knowledge, right? It's not something you can learn in a day or in a month. But so it was just an intro, and we moved our bodies to this notation. Like we did a score together in the classroom with this choreographer to really understand that like our movements can be described through drawing in these notational systems, and it doesn't have to just be dance. And actually, there's a history of labor movements being transcribed in these systems, but mostly that was happening in terms of like how to maximize efficiency in the factory. And so our goals were a bit different in terms of like how we started out like very basic. So the students had an assignment. They had a weekly labor notation assignment that they had to submit. That was a notational study of the labor that we had performed during that week. So they could choose like what specific, like how broad or how specific they wanted it to be. And they had to develop their own notational system rather than use the Laban notation. Well, it was really their choice. One of the students just did Laban notation the whole studio, which was really great because he got kind of very invested in it and knowledgeable about it. And then the other students were experimenting with how to develop their own notational systems. And, you know, some of it was more successful than others. It's something that is very, very hard to do. And I'm going to keep working on it with students. One of the things that's really interesting to me about it in terms of how it informs design, this is going to be a little bit of a long answer. So often we use drawings, as designers, we use drawings to communicate our idea, and then they are legally binding documents, right? These are construction documents. Often a laborer doesn't even see the drawing. They just get the information communicated to them from the foreman who understands the drawing, and then they build it, right? So someone describes what they're supposed to do and they do it. They're following instructions, and the instructions are the drawing. And with something like notation, I tell my students that if we're talking about agency and providing more agency to people who build and maintain landscapes, that means giving over some of our own agency. So like you can't decide everything as a designer if you want somebody else to have a bit of agency within that design. Like they need to decide some things too. That's what agency is. So how do we still like create a design that leaves room for other people to have some stake, some agency, some connection to it? And I think strangely enough, dance notation or notational systems might be one avenue, because you can describe something through a series of movements that still leaves a lot of room for someone else to interpret and build, right? So if you could design a landscape through notation and that's how it's described rather than a drawing, you know, what the outcome is sort of unpredictable, and it's based on the person who constructs it and builds it. And like one analogy that we talked about with this curator of the dance notation was the idea that, okay, so you think that the choreographer has all the power, right? Like they're the ones who invented this dance, they defined it, they have the power. But ultimately, it's the dancer on stage who does the thing, and they can just decide whatever they want. They can just do it. And they're the ones ultimately who have the power because they're the ones doing it. And I think that there's an interesting correlation there that we could amplify in terms of like the designer slash choreographer role and the dancer, labor role. And I would like to see those power dynamics disturbed.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah, no, that
Long
was
answer.
no, but a beautiful answer. And honestly, this is the first time I've ever heard of this concept, or that between dance notation and the Laban notation. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting. Okay, so we have another comment. Hi, I love this approach. In my work, I both design and care for gardens in an urban park. There is, however, a divide between people who care for non-green aspects of the park, trash removal, hired by the Parks Department versus the gardeners hired by the nonprofit. How might we apply this approach to urban spaces?
Yeah, so it's interesting because then you're talking about another divide within the divide, because it's like, okay, the designer or the client, and then the divide between the labor, and then you're saying that there's a divide then between different classes of laborers. So there's like the gardeners, the maintenance crew, and then there's the kind of more like janitorial aspects. And then there are different organizations that manage them. Gosh, I don't know. Sometimes I just don't know what to do. I think that I wish that there could be sort of more collective efforts at unionization that weren't based on like the class distinction of workers. So right now, it's not possible really to have like a union between a blue collar work that includes both blue collar and white collar workers, just because of the existing laws. And I feel like that is a necessary thing to change, so that like landscape architects and these gardening crews and these other workers who care for those built landscapes could be part of like similar groups, and collectively bargain and take on this idea that like we are all workers, and maybe it's organized around like the kind of types of work that you're producing, like a landscape, like an urban landscape, for example.
Thank you. And we've got a related one. How can we shift the material conditions of laborers? Like, how do you start with creating solidarity between the designers and landscapers?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, I don't have all the answers. I'm starting by writing about it and talking to people about this, and hoping that everyone who is involved and listening, will reflect on it. I am working with a couple of landscape architecture firms right now on like my next project. And we're trying to develop some ways, like we're looking at their kind of practices, and thinking about ways that we can intervene in sort of practical ways that aren't like shaking up everything, but like little interventions that could bring designers and laborers together more closely and more collaboratively, like from the beginning of the design process. So we're brainstorming on these little adjustments, and then we're gonna do some experiments and document that and see where it goes. So that's what I'm working on. I mean, if I knew the answer, I would just, scream it from the rooftops, but I don't know. I think many practices are very different, and they're organized very differently. A design build firm is going to be very different than kind of like a global landscape firm. I think there's a lot more room to negotiate depending on the scale of work that you do. So the global landscape firm who like subcontracts everything, never has any contact with laborers whatsoever, that's going to be pretty hard to like shift things. But a smaller firm, design and build firm, definitely, but even just like smaller practices that have a little bit more direct connection with laborers or can like foster those connections, that's, I think, where we can start, because that's actionable. That can happen. That can start happening now. For me, I think it's important to reflect on the scale of work that one does and what it prohibits, what it fosters and what it prohibits, right? So if like we have these major, hugely scaled projects that are like the waterfront developments or the huge restoration projects and such, and the ultimate goals of those projects could be like stellar, like what we want to be doing in the world as landscape architects. But I feel like if what the costs are is that you have to use like precarious labor practices and put, you know, workers at risk, at increased climate risk in terms of heat and other such precarities, you know, I would question the scale of work that you choose to do. Personally, I choose small scale things because it allows for that human, that direct human to human connection.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I see. I feel like you have so many of the answers. And I wonder, what can we do to stay connected with your research, as you know, untangle more of these, you know, answers?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna put my Instagram, which is like my little, I put a lot of stuff from my classes on this Instagram. And I'll put my Twitter account, because I post when I publish something, I'll post it on Twitter. And you can follow me there. I'll keep you posted. I have, yeah, I just published another article that's called Cares Repair Landscapes Labor. And it's all about this topic, but more specifically about H-2B guest worker visas, who are primarily from Mexico, and they make up the majority of landscape workers in this country. And kind of, I'm talking about how we often, as landscape folks, talk about care as part of our work, and how that claim to care needs to be maintained a bit, or cultivated in the sense to include care for the human being as part of that work in relation to immigrant laborers. So you can check that out. That's new. You know what? That one is not paywalled. Sorry, I'm like on the chat now. So if you just look it up, the journal is like totally open access. There's the title. And then I should have that Dumbarton Oaks piece published in a book called Landscapes in the Making. Maybe that'll be like 2025. I'm not sure. Maybe this year, who knows?
Hopefully. Okay, we have two more questions that our staff picked out of the chat.
Sure.
What can we do to help undocumented laborers become documented?
Wow. I don't think like personal, like if you know an undocumented laborer, I don't think there's anything that like you can do personally for that individual. It's interesting because they, you know, often the kind of like anti-immigrant sentiment is like, well, why don't they just come legally? And people just don't understand that that is not possible. Like I have family in Mexico that has been on wait lists. You know, my mom has been here for 50 years now. And she's been trying to bring her family members over legally, and they've been on wait lists for like 25 years, 30 years. And they just have, you just have to wait. There's that long of a process because there's so few immigrants from Mexico allowed into the country legally. other than the guest worker visas, right? So if you have an individual that you know that you want to help, I don't know. I don't think that that is very possible. But I think if that's a passion or an interest, I think just getting involved in immigrant rights organizations is, and like showing support and showing up is really important.
Okay, thank you. And can you share some of the stories of the impact of the work in the Digger Studio has had on students?
They love it. They love it. I mean, it's so fun, and I feel like tooting my own horn, but it is, they say it's a transformative experience. For many of them, like they just have never done anything like that. They've never like handled tools. They've never gone camping, and it's like, I think it's transformational to get out of the classroom, to like just learn outside of the classroom. We really spend very little time indoors, even when we're like talking and looking at drawings and stuff, it's outside. And that's a huge difference. I think it's really interesting for them. I have this approach that's like a non-hierarchical structure. So I'm not like, I know everything and you're only going to learn from me. It's more of an egalitarian sensibility where like I get to learn from them, they get to learn from me, they get to learn from landscape laborers, they get to teach landscape laborers. Like we're all in this mutual exchange knowledge, and in that doesn't usually happen like in classes, right? In design studios, especially and stuff. So that is really exciting for them. So they say. And I think also that it's a very embodied, like personal experience, because we're all physically working together, scale of labor. We're out there like every day. It's hot, it's hard. We're in the rain, we're working, it's like these kind of difficult and challenging formational experiences, because you're forming like these bonds with these people over a short and intense period of time. And you're working collectively. So you're building skills that we don't teach as Americans, to like make decisions together, to like build consensus, to work collectively. Like we just don't know how to do that. So that's a big aspect of the work that I think is pretty radical from what a typical design studio is. And I don't know, they love it. They're so excited about it. And it's just a really cool, amazing, special experience for me too. I think it's intense and special, and they see that.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Michelle.